Give me a little intro there, Gomer.
You're listening to the Station 71 podcast. My name is Mario, and this week I'm joined by my co-host,
Ryan.
That's right. We're riding solo for a guys' night this week.
Boys' night.
Beth is off in Disney having what should be the time of her life. She's going to have some stuff to talk about next week, which will be interesting.
Mm-hmm. I'm excited. Tune in for that, listeners, because I want to hear what she has to say as well.
Yeah, and I feel like we probably should at least give a little insight that we are at a point right now where Beth's annual pass is running out, and there was discussion of that maybe being her last AP trip for a while. So we'll see if her opinion changes. We'll see if she renews her annual pass. Gonna be interesting, but
it is. I think she hits that very mid-range experience of dealing with being an annual pass holder, where she's close enough to make kind of quick weekend trips sometimes, but then also, have some far planned out trips too, whereas I'm probably not going to give up my annual pass until something majorly bad happens just because it's so cheap and close for me. But I think her experience is much more typical to the average Disney park goer. So I want to see what she ultimately decides to do.
Yeah, I'm interested, and I feel like, I don't know, we've had a lot of negativity on this show recently in terms of like our opinions towards the way that Disney's handling a lot of things. So I'm interested to see if, that plays into Beth's opinion at all and where she kind of stands. But of course, that's a topic for next week. But we've got some other stuff on the docket tonight. Let's dive into our news as usual. So first thing that we've got on here is we've got some Galactic Star Cruiser news. There was an announcement today that kind of like was a little teaser video for Galactic Star Cruiser, but one of the things that Beth so graciously threw in the show notes is probably one of my least favorite little bits of Galactic Star Cruiser news. Part of the lore that they are going to be using for this is based around a novel, which they did for Galaxy's Edge as well. But the lore around this is that Han Solo and Princess Leia will have honeymooned on the Galactic Star Cruiser. I think this is Disney catering to fans a little too far.
Yeah, so I'm also kind of confused, like, canonically, how this fits in to what they're trying to do here, and if that works. I will be the first to tell you I'm not the most vastly knowledgeable person about Star Wars, but does that timeline follow with Galaxy's Edge and everything?
So the way that they announced it today, because this is like, this news article is a little bit old at this point, but what they talked about today on the reveal video was that it's going to be like the Halcyon ship, I think is what it's called, is it's like it's basically a cruise in space, but or the ship has been used for like several thousands of years, hundreds of years in Star Wars time. But the ship is basically refurbished into a newer, more like how it was supposed to look when it took its maiden voyage kind of thing. So the current iteration of this ship is like if you were to go on a really renovated cruise ship is basically what happened here in terms of story. So I'm assuming this book is going to take place on like a previous voyage, because it seems like it, from the video today, it's set canonically in timeline with Galaxy's Edge, which takes place between The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, if I remember correctly. So
Okay.
this is just kind of like this book that they're talking about is going to be back lore for the ship, even though it's not like the whole book is about their honeymoon.
Gotcha.
It's
Okay.
that's my biggest problem with Galaxy's Edge and this whole Star Cruiser experience. I think it probably would have made the most sense if they just didn't set it in a timeline. And I think the reason that they did that is obviously Rise of the Resistance exists, and that kind of forces. Have you done Rise yet? I can't remember.
Yes.
Okay, so Rise kind of like forces them into that timeline, right? Like it's all about the
Right.
First Order. It's all about all of that stuff. So I think that specific piece is really the only thing that kind of ties it to a timeline. Like they can rotate the characters and stuff out, right? But
Yeah.
like if it wasn't for Rise, like everything in Batu could be like floating in a different timeline. It could be at any point. It could be your own Star Wars experience, and I think that that's kind of going to be a fault of Star Cruiser if they set it so heavily in the period that they're talking about, because they're also talking about. Um, I can send you the video if you want to watch it real quick, and we can talk about that too. Or actually, Al posted it in our Discord earlier under the Star Wars channel. If you want to watch that,
Oh,
it's like
okay.
3 minutes. But part of it that they talk about is like, um, Rey and Kylo Ren meet on this ship at some point, and that's part of the story. And like, I just really want to know how this is all going to work because it feels like
Wait.
they're really locking it in.
Man, that also sounds like they're very much trying to shoehorn plots in here to connect it more.
Yeah, and that's what confuses me. I don't know. Did you or were you gonna watch it real quick or
Yeah, I've got it
okay? Go
pulled
ahead,
up
watch it,
right
and then we can
now.
talk about it.
Okay. Okay. I'm done.
So, yeah, I don't know how I feel about it. Like, I think the video that they presented is interesting in theory. Like, it's not. It doesn't. I don't know. It doesn't feel like from the little bits that we've gotten, it's going to be all based around the Skywalker lore, which is fine. I'm over that. Like, I don't want any more Skywalker stories. Um, and I think it's going to be like I'm hoping it's very loosely tied and just enough that like people who have seen the movies can enjoy it. But I think the world of Star Wars is far more interesting to me than the stories that Star Wars can present right now.
Yeah, and I think that's who you want to make this resort for, you know?
Right.
I mean, most of the people that are super casual fans that aren't going to know people or characters outside of the main characters probably aren't going to drop the money that it takes to stay in this place. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that you're right. I think most of the really hardcore fans would want more of a deep dive into the Star Wars universe than just throwing the characters that are already front and center on the screen into this resort.
Yeah, and we'll see how it plays out. I mean, we're close. We're very close. And I know I'm never going to do this. Like
Hmm.
this is not anything that I feel like I have any right to complain about because it's not anything that one I can afford, but two like I feel like is worth the money for me. Um I mean, we'll see how the reviews come out. We'll see what people say, and I think that that's going to be the ultimate test of like how long this lasts as a high dollar premium ticket. Like
Hmm.
it's
Yeah,
it's all weird.
that's what I'm really curious about because I'm pretty much in the same boat that even if I did have enough money to stay at this place, there's 3 or 4 other resorts at Disney that I'm going to stay at for half the cost before I do this. So yeah, I never see myself doing it, but I really would like to see somebody, who is a hardcore Star Wars fan, give their opinion after staying here and see if it really lived up to the expectations.
I
'Cause
surprisingly want to see a more casual Star Wars fan
that's
because
true.
I think like for me the part that's going to be weird is, and I feel like I've talked about this a lot on here, I think the current model of this resort can't last as long as like they expect it to. Like
That's what. Yeah, I mean, I know Disney's crunched the numbers on this, and they have all kinds of data to go off of, for how long they could keep this up at the prices they're charging and everything. But you're right, man. I don't see it. I don't
Yeah.
see this resort booked to capacity in 5 to 10 years. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And even then, I don't like. My fear is that this is going to go from Star Wars experience to Star Wars themed hotel within that 5-year span. And I mean, listen, if it does do that and it drops in price, like then it may be more worth it to stay there. Not that I think the interactive experience is going to be not worth it. I think it's going to be definitely worth it. If anybody can pull it off, it's Disney. But I also
Mhm.
think that, like we talked about the last time, it's such a high dollar premium that they have to offer some kind of incentive for um you staying there. Like, I don't want to pay for park tickets if I'm going to pay all of this money to stay at this resort, or I better like the stay at this resort better make it so that I don't really want to go to the parks,
Mhm.
which like that's going to be a feat in and of itself. So we'll see. I mean, it could change. Things could go well. We could be singing his praises in a week.
Maybe we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. So next news topic that we have on here, which I think this is so overdue. Mobile cast complement feature is now allowing for um specific individuals to be recognized in the Walt Disney World app. So, My Disney Experience has rolled out that is a very weirdly worded headline. Side note, the cast complement feature in the My Disney Experience lets you specify the cast members that you're, you know, now complimenting and basically give a more personalized compliment. Uh, I think this is so overdue.
Mhm.
Disney's system for cast recognition has been so dated in the last several years. But yeah, if you want to compliment a cast member, all you have to do is use the search feature to search for cast compliment in the My Disney Experience app and select the drop downs for location and then the name of the cast member that assisted you and give them the compliment. So this is nice.
Yeah, I absolutely love this. I have bashed the My Disney Experience app for the as long as we've been doing this podcast, and this is one of the best features I think they've ever added to it. You're right. It used to be very difficult to actually, give a shout out to a specific cast member to the point where I think a lot of guests would just kind of give up and not bother go through with it. And this makes it so easy and it's fantastic. I still say, the cast members are one of the absolute greatest parts of the parks, and they make it so much different than any of the competition. And any way that you can show them how much work they do and how memorable they make the experience, I'm all for. So I love this.
Yeah, I definitely think that this, like I said, this feature is so overdue. I mean, before you could kind of compliment them in the app, but it wasn't personal, and you could, um, in the most archaic fashion, walk down to guest relations and compliment them, or you could, if you were on social media, you could send there's like a cast compliments Twitter that Disney monitored and sent compliments through. Like it just feels like it was about time that they brought it to their first party software.
Yeah,
uh, and then this last one. Have you seen Encanto yet? Before I talk about this.
I have not. I know I'm so
Oh, you're
far
so far
behind.
behind.
I
Um,
know.
so I want to talk about this, but it's going to be a little bit of a like stinker on here since you haven't really watched it. But apparently, Lin-Manuel Miranda approached Bob Chapek about adding an Encanto ride to the Disney parks. And I wanted to kind of throw this out there because I know this has been having some like weird discourse on the internet where people are like, they just put it in Epcot and it would go in Mexico. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that this is actually probably one of those few rides that would benefit from a storybook style attraction. I mean, he specifically called out Ariel's Undersea Adventure at Disneyland, um, and I think it's interesting to think about like how this movie would make an interesting attraction. I think to not give you any spoilers because I don't want to ruin this movie for you. Um, I think that this movie or this yeah, this movie would benefit from an attraction that's very similar to like a Mystic Manor or like Haunted Mansion, where it's more about the location than the actual like here's a recap of the story. And I
Hmm.
wholeheartedly think that this would make it an interesting attraction. So
Well, I will have to watch it and see.
yeah, you definitely will. I was pleasantly surprised by this movie. I didn't think I was gonna like it as much as I did, and I think it's kind of grown on me because I had some negative-ish things to say about it in the beginning, but I definitely think it's worth it.
Cool.
Um,
I've heard pretty high praises from it from most of what I've been reading online, so it's definitely on my list to check out.
yeah, I mean, you're Mr. Busy now, so
I know, I know.
um, yeah, so let's dive into our news topic this week. This is another one that comes from Taco Bell Mel on Discord. She had suggested that we put the parks into history-defined eras, kind of like how everybody classifies the movie eras, like the Renaissance, the Golden Age, the Dark Ages, stuff like that. And possibly exploring how you name and identify each of the park's different eras. I think this is going to be so far off of that idea because we're probably going to just wander down like history of when things opened and stuff like that.
Well, most likely.
It's I'm I think we're less using this as like here's a block of time and here's what this means and what we think, and more like hey, here's potentially when this kind of thing started. So it's going to be an interesting discussion this week. We're kind of flying by the seat of our pants. We do have I have to thank Beth because before she left, she kind of set us up for success, and we're probably not going to use it. Um, but she threw her suggestions in here, and I will give her the credit that she is due for naming some of these eras and coming up with some good ideas on behalf of this topic.
Yeah.
So, that said, is there anything that you kind of had specifically laid out before we kind of just like dive into it?
I didn't have any hard specifics, so if you do,
Yeah,
welcome to start us off.
phew, I didn't have any hard specifics either. The only thing that I wanted to make sure that we didn't really do, and I know we kind of briefly talked about this, was like using more than just the CEOs to define the eras, because it's very easy to say like the Eisner era of Disney was relatively cheap, and like we've talked about that in terms of like the eras, and I don't think that that's really a fun discussion.
Yeah.
I do want to kind of try as we start to talk about like chunks of things that happen, maybe like say what we would classify them as. I know that's kind of in the like the suggestion of new or of topic here, but like the suggestion that Mel said was for example, marking Frozen Ever After as the start of the IP of Disney Parks era.
Yeah.
So kind of like a maybe one or two word summary of what would make that era or what would classify that era.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that's a good point because, certainly the CEOs of the time had some part to play, like you were saying with Eisner. We were able to get the, more cheaper, not e-ticket level attractions that kind of paved the way for different stuff. Whereas, now with, since Bob Iger has been in charge, it feels like we'll never get anything that isn't a massive construction and, you know, pushing to be a permanent e-ticket attraction from here on out. So that does play some part. But like you were saying, we don't want to just say this is how it was when this person was leading the charge, because there's a lot of other people that are involved in what goes on than just the CEO. So
yeah. And I think I mean I'm kind of stealing Beth's thunder here with the way that she started this off, but I think that she makes the very good point that like the early eras of Walt Disney World, like 71 to 87 would probably be like the classic era, or I kind of tried to keep them similar to the movies, and I said this could be like the golden age, because
hmm
this is like the classic attractions. Everything is kind of, for the most part, pre-existing things that were sent over from Disneyland.
yes, the
And
tried and true.
yeah, and I think a lot of those attractions have held up. Like, yeah, there's certain things that aren't around anymore, but for the most part, a lot of these attractions are kind of mainstays of the park.
I mean, honestly, if you you look at the list, it's kind of eye-opening to see how many of the opening day attractions are still there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a huge amount, and like you were saying, obviously when they were planning Disney World, they had 10 to 15 years of seeing what worked at Disneyland before Magic Kingdom opened. So yeah, they're gonna bring in the e-ticket attractions that they already knew that people liked. So you've got your classics like Country Bear Jamboree in there. They're still around. But honestly, if you look at, I mean, there's more on a list of opening day attractions that's still there that really it's not anymore, which is pretty crazy to think.
Yeah. And I was kind of thinking about this too, like, there's a chunk of time in there where I would probably split it off a little bit, like even off of what Beth had on here, because you have that period from like 84 to 89-ish where a lot of Epcot was opening. And I think that that kind of
Mhm.
deserves its own era. Um, Obviously, we just talked about like how a lot of the classics are ported from Disneyland, but Epcot was kind of its own thing, and I think that that definitely set the standard for how edutainment is kind of designed in the blood of this park specifically.
Mhm.
And even then, like that's kind of the other thing that I was thinking about too when I was thinking about this too is like even if the Epcot moves away from the edutainment idea, which we've kind of talked about before, where some of this stuff is starting to be less focused on this original Epcot idea. I think that this is very much a defined era that a lot of people really love,
Mhm.
especially if you look at like some of the stuff that's on there. Like you have the Seas, you have Maelstrom, you have Body Wars, you have Cranium Command, you have um basically all of the Wonders of Life Pavilion. You have like all of the opening pavilions that came over there. Like I don't know. I think that that's just like a nostalgic period for a lot of Disney fans.
Yeah, and I mean, you're definitely right about Epcot opening and this being such a huge change. I mean, Magic Kingdom wasn't just a carbon copy of Disneyland, but like we were saying, they were able to pick and choose and see what worked and bring the best of it over to the East Coast. But with Epcot, not only were they doing something that was completely new for them, it was completely new for like high level theme parks at all. Like I don't even think in today's age, somebody else would like another company would try to come out with a theme park that's so based on this edutainment idea. It's I, even today, if Disney was opening up a new theme park and they hadn't opened Epcot in '82, that I don't think Disney would go through with this. Because it was different, because it wasn't IP based, because it was kind of them taking a risk on stuff. I'm very glad that they did, but yeah, I really wonder if it 2022 right now, would we get an Epcot if Epcot didn't exist? And I don't think so. I think this was back when Disney was willing to take more of a risk on stuff and throw things at the wall and see what stuck.
Yeah, I kind of struggled with a word for this one. Like I was thinking the one that kept coming up was like innovative for me, because I feel like you're right. That's not really an idea that a lot of places would have or would follow through with anymore. Like, I mean, I don't know. I could see if Disney wanted to do something that had new ideas and things like that, but I think that this was so there was no market for this. And Disney just
Hmm.
like Disney threw an idea at the wall that obviously, I mean, it was Walt's vision, like not necessarily the Epcot that we got, but having this additional park and, you know, having some of the things in there that they couldn't have done. But I think that like this park doesn't exist without Walt's vision of Epcot. And I think because of that, like no one else would do anything like this. Yeah, Disney may open a park like Disney Sea that's not necessarily IP themed or something like that, but at the heart of it, like this park existed solely as like an educational an edutainment, for lack of a better word, standard. And I don't think that anybody would do this again.
No. And you make a good point too about this, even though it wasn't, what Walt had really imagined for his Epcot. I think you're right. Without his original vision, without him having such a drive to do something that was based on the future and based on educating people, that this wouldn't have happened. And that is kind of a risky move for a company that had grown as large as Disney had now to make for what is the second theme park at Walt Disney World. This is what's making Walt Disney World what they've basically been marketing it that it's going to be since they started making it, that it's more than just one park. It's more than just a thing you go to for a day or two. This is like the vacation destination. So yeah, for them to place so much emphasis on education, I think that's very risky. But as we see, it I think it's paid off. Obviously, I know for a long time Epcot was kind of like the redheaded stepchild of the Disney parks, but I think now today, and especially what it looks like they have planned for the future of Epcot, that it's a park that's really kind of grown into its own.
Yeah. Did you have anything in those kind of windows for your like eras specifically that you wanted to talk about, or just hitting some bullet points?
So for this one, it's hard for me because obviously this is, before we were born. So
Yeah.
you can look at what was there, you can look at what came before it and what came after, but it's hard to say that this had a certain feeling because I wasn't there. But it is to me like the risk taking era of Disney. They moved in from the very much tried and true, and then flipped completely 180 and decided to throw something at the wall and see what happened.
Yeah. I think part of that, like, kind of same idea that I struggled with too was this next chunk of time because a lot of things happened here.
Yeah.
So Beth had this listed as the cartoon era from 88 to 2003. So I kind of agree with that, but I think again a lot of other weird things happen in there. Like I wanted to kind of the first thing I thought of was I wanted to dub like 89 to 99 ish the Hollywood era, but again that kind of like lifts the rules a little bit because most of what I was thinking was based on Hollywood studios. Like that park has such a unique concept in and of itself that you know again, Disney today probably wouldn't do something like original Hollywood studios. And even then, you could probably shrink that down a little bit. I actually probably would shrink that down a little bit, um, because original Hollywood studios, like we talked about, only had those, like what, two attractions.
Mm-hmm.
So even then, it's like you can kind of define that as the era of I guess that would probably be the Hollywood era because it was more geared towards the movie experience. But then you also have Animal Kingdom opening up in that same window that like
Right.
I feel like so much just happens and I think unless you define the eras for those specific parks, it's a little hard. I think the cartoon era may make some of the most sense, but kind of denies a little bit of the other interesting weird things that Disney did at this time.
I think Beth calling it that is definitely on point for Magic Kingdom because that was. And I know we said we weren't going to like fall too much into it, but I do think a lot of this had to do with Michael Eisner
Yeah.
because, this was when he was wanting to, do his singles and doubles ideals through the company as a whole. So this came at a time when, hey, what small attractions can we throw out there that aren't risky that we know people will like, so that we can do some other riskier stuff that people might not like. And I think leaning on the cartoons and the existing IP, that people already know and love in the Disney parks is why we got a lot of these attractions that we did during this time. So I think that's the cartoon era definitely for Magic Kingdom is pretty spot on. But yeah, this does feel like another huge chunk of time that I feel like we need to break down further because yeah, a lot of stuff going on at Hollywood Studios, like you said, more changes coming at Epcot, even, the initial opening of Animal Kingdom, which yeah, for me, this is the era that falls into when I started going to the parks as a very small child. Um, so this is the first time that I have. No, go ahead.
I was going to say one thing that I think may actually benefit us a little bit here is kind of looking at how Disney filmmaking is broken up usually, like the 7 eras of filmmaking, and maybe filing some of these in as those kind of specific titles. Like they're more broad, right? So like the golden age is the original animated classics. Those are like Snow White, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo. And then preceded by that is your wartime era, which is when they started making the packaged films that you could kind of feel the war efforts kind of restraining on, which I have an idea, and I'm going to say that all of these after, and it's going to sound morbid when I bring this one up, but I think this one specifically is more like Three Caballeros, Fun and Fancy Free, the Ichabod and Mr. Toad, like the movies that unfortunately not a lot of people remember.
Mhm.
And then you have the Silver Age, which is known as like the Restoration Age, because Disney started to try to wean off of the wartime films, the package stuff, and you start to see more big budget things. So Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, up until the Jungle Book. And then after that, you have the Bronze Age, which is right after Walt Disney dies. That's Aristocats, Robin Hood. That's also the same time when they started falling heavily into that uh, xenography style of animation. So all of the movies start to kind of look the same.
Mhm.
You have the Renaissance, which, I mean, we all know and love. Our demographic, I'm assuming, grew up with this.
See, and
But
that's why I don't know how valid my opinion is because to me the Renaissance era of Disney films seems like the highest tier. And I know that might be true, but I know that that's probably mainly warped because that's the movies that I grew up watching.
yeah, so
Um,
specifically for this one, like just to briefly kind of skim this real quick, this is like Little Mermaid to Tarzan, all of those like big Disney classics from the 90s ish. You also have after that post Renaissance, which is where things are supposedly going downhill. I mean, a lot of these movies do have quality issues, but the reason I want to bring this up is because I think a lot of the filmmaking eras have that like diamond in the rough esque movie. Like this is Fantasia to Bolt, and obviously, movies like Dinosaur, Chicken Little, Brother Bear, Home on the Range. None of those are like as big name as Renaissance era movies. But then you
no.
also have Emperor's New Groove and Lilo and Stitch, which I think those potentially could kind of fall in there. Like they're kind of like that shiny-ish same Disney movie, but they don't fall into the same as their eras.
Yeah, definitely. Those are diamonds in the rough for sure.
Yeah, and then they consider now the revival era, um, which is 2010 to present. So starting with Princess and the Frog, working up to pretty much every movie that's come out. But
It's
the
kind of
reason,
funny that Disney goes through this like up and down cycle with the movie eras. It's like a very good one and then a bad one and then a very good one and then a bad one and then a very good one.
yeah,
And it's like very cyclical. But if we're looking at it in the lens of this time, I think because or I should not in the lens of this time and the time period that we were talking about of the parks here in the late 80s to late 90s that because those Renaissance movies were doing so well it felt like Disney was like how can we get this content in the park and it was I I think that it was a lot of it was, them trying to get it while it was hot and get IP based stuff in the parks, especially Magic Kingdom.
Yeah, I would
So
definitely agree. I also think like the reason I wanted to bring these up is because I think that the parks, like thinking about it now off script, I think the parks kind of follow a similar style, right? Like the golden age would be that classic age that we just defined. I honestly think that Epcot kind of would fall into like not really this wartime era of things, but I would say that this is like a mixture of that wartime and almost the uh Bronze Age ish. Um, or maybe not even. Maybe it's the Silver Age of Disney parks where like things are good, but they're not quite the standard that they were before. Like maybe we just totally skipped that wartime era because there's nothing major in there besides like the death of Walt Disney, but that can kind of be felt through most of Epcot.
yeah, and I don't know, I don't ever remember seeing an era of the parks that was as dark as the the wartime movies were. Like such a sharp drop off of quality. I don't think there's obviously been up and down times in the parks, but I don't think anything has fallen off like the movies fell off during that time period.
Yeah, and I think if thinking about it like that, then our Bronze Age is like the opening of Hollywood studios right up until Animal Kingdom, maybe even the start of
Yeah.
Animal Kingdom. Because like Animal Kingdom, it's a great park and it's definitely like the um I guess the newest of them that kind of has that like Disney-esque feel, and maybe Animal Kingdom is our renaissance.
I
Like,
think so. I
yeah, I
really do. If you look at the state of the parks before Animal Kingdom opened, you have Magic Kingdom, which was again, like we were saying, it was taking the classic ones. It wasn't doing a whole lot of new stuff at the time. It was, doing the tried and true stuff, which is fine. But it wasn't exactly groundbreaking. And then you've got Hollywood Studios, which was very much still a half day park at this time.
yeah,
And you've got Epcot, which was definitely doing its own unique thing, but a lot of people, it was even less child friendly than it is now. And Disney being a family resort destination, Epcot had kind of a negative opinion with a lot of families at this time. So, yeah, really until Animal Kingdom opened, it was kind of like the dip down and probably what a lot of people would consider, quality Disney park going experience. And then, bam, we get Animal Kingdom, which is incredible.
yeah. And I think like I don't know if it's cheating to define them by the same eras as like the Disney movies, but I think that that's kind of like where it is. And even if you look at it the same way, like after Animal Kingdom, you kind of have that post Renaissance too, right? Like Animal Kingdom opens, and then Disney starts kind of, well, we've got these unique ideas for parks, and the Eisner era almost ends, and you kind of have like that IP dipping era where things start to kind of be more heavily focused on IP, but I don't know that it's I don't know. I don't know that it's going to end up coming out of that. Like maybe we haven't come out of the post Renaissance yet.
I I don't know. Again, it's hard to judge because it's like this is when I'm firsthand experiencing the park, so I'm sure a lot of it has to do with how old I was at the time, and I find myself wanting to categorize stuff by like the age I was too, because
Yeah.
that's experiencing the parks in a different way. But I don't know. I feel like there was this another time period in between the opening of Animal Kingdom and probably up until maybe 4 or 5 years ago that was and I don't mean this in such a negative way, but Disney kind of resting on its laurels, them not pushing to come out with a whole lot of new stuff, and just kind of minor expansions to the park doing what the parks do, you know.
Yeah.
And then obviously the what we if we want to call it the post renaissance that we're in now, where this massive expansion is going on throughout all the parks, it feels like.
Or maybe that's the revival era. Maybe we
Maybe.
are also living in that. I mean, the other weird thing is I think we're doing this episode at such a bad time too. Like, this may be something that if we're still doing this podcast in 5 years, we revisit, because I think COVID totally put a damper on what could have been the greatest revival period of the Disney parks.
Very true.
And I mean, if, taking everything that Disney says as truth, like, say everything they announced at D23 was planned, ready to go, we were going to get it, it's going to happen. Honestly, a lot of those big changes that they announced at the last major D23, that could have really defined a lot of the parks. Like, Epcot would have gotten some incredible new life to it.
Yeah.
And I think that definitely puts us in kind of a revival. But I think, unfortunately, I know I've said before that I think Disney used COVID as an excuse to shutter a lot of things like that. And that may be true. It may not be. Who knows? I'm not in those board meetings. But, like, I think if it weren't for COVID, we could have potentially gotten a very big revival.
I think so. A lot of the momentum that the parks had after the 2017 D23 to me was like the pinnacle. Like it was like every 5 minutes somebody was posting some crazy thing that the parks were coming out with. It was being announced. It was all huge stuff, and like you're saying, yeah, that was carrying so much momentum into the expansion of the parks. And then with COVID coming, it's just like, I don't know, I feel like so much of the momentum has been taken out of the sales for Disney at this point because of it. And it makes me fearful that it's gonna very much affect how Disney does things from now.
Yeah.
That it will be even less risk taking, be more tried and true stuff. The next time we see an economic downturn and people aren't able to go to the parks anymore, is that gonna, lead Disney to playing it safe even more? But I don't know. I like to think now that COVID was kind of a minor hiccup and that they're picking up steam again. We're getting a lot of the attractions that were announced way back when that are finally about to open. Tron's about to open. Guardians of the Galaxy is about to open. Like, those are pretty major rides that are coming. And, maybe once we get past this, it will, be more of a pick-me-up.
Yeah, and I think, like, the optimism of all of that is kind of like the important thing of being a Disney fan right now. Not to be very like COVID-y talk on here, but I feel like that's the thing that keeps me interested, right? Like, 2017, you hit it on the head. That was kind of like the pinnacle of being a Disney fan. Like, that was the, I mean, that was what our first episode was, a recap of D23. And I remember talking about all that stuff, and it was like, wow, I can't wait to experience that. And like some of that stuff we got to experience so far, right? Like Pandora, we got to see that. We got to see, Galaxy's Edge come to life. Like, we got to see all of that, and I think Disney bit off way more than they could chew in that 2017 D23. There is it without a doubt in my mind. I think that was the world had its eyes on Disney for the sake of the things that they were announcing. And, here we are years later. Tron's like about to open, I think. Guardians of the Galaxy has to be close. Like, I don't think Tron was anywhere near a point where it would have been like remotely ready within the time frame, even if COVID didn't happen. And I think that that's also the fault of, like, that, like I said, them biting off more than they can chew. But I think stuff like that is like, to me, it marks that they were thinking about doing new stuff. And I think that that's why I would consider this more of a revival era than, I guess, a downward era, which most people probably would. I think that's why I have so much optimism about, the park's future and stuff like that. Quick flashing to what Beth had on here, because we kind of like just railed off of her notes here. She has, in her cartoon era, she made a good point that I kind of want to go back to. she put in here that there was the need to introduce cartoony elements into attractions that caused the demise of cherished favorite attractions, changing the original Journey into Imagination to a much worse version, Journey into Your Imagination, and then the still worse original version. So I think that that's kind of an interesting point of her kind of branching it out of Epcot or out into Epcot a little bit. I do kind of agree with that. That is, I would say that probably makes it more of a dark era. And I think that I think keeping it in line with the movie eras actually makes the most sense now that I'm thinking about it. Then she also put 2004 to 2011, the unique and sometimes weird incorporation era. So Disney Park saw the introduction of ideas that became devices within the Disney's community, like Stitch's Great Escape, as well as concepts that had fans scratching their heads, asking, "What's this?" Journey into Narnia, Prince Caspian. I will talk about this attraction every time it comes up. And then multiple High School Musical dance parties. So yeah, no, I like that she brought those up because, you know, my weird "what the hell is this" with Prince Caspian that has never left me.
You know, it's funny. I was thinking back to me kind of being biased and separating stuff into, you know, how I was experiencing the parks. And looking back, it's like, okay, this was the era that I went to Disney the least. It was like when I was an older teenager, you know, so Disney wasn't a every year trip. It was like we might go every couple of years. We were interspersing it a lot more with Universal and stuff. And it's like, looking back, I'm kind of like, I didn't miss much. I guess that was probably the best time to not be going to the parks.
For me, it's so funny because like I feel like I've talked about this before, that like I have a lot of nostalgia for Hollywood Studios. Like that was by far my favorite park for the longest time, and it still, I think, is up there. I mean, this is probably super controversial, but I think it's probably better than Epcot right now. But
Yeah, I agree with that.
I feel like for me, this was the period where like we were going a lot, and I remember weird things like I know I've talked about the Prince Caspian Narnia thing, and like this was where Disney was really trying to lean into the like, hey, this is a movie studio, but also here's a bunch of movie props.
Yeah. You know, I think it was. Granted, I didn't see it in person. I loved when you went through the detail of this in that episode way back when, because I would honestly love to see more stuff like this. Like, I know it probably seems just like really touristy and kitschy and everything, but like I love going to Planet Hollywood and seeing, you know, the set pieces, the costumes, and that kind of stuff, the memorabilia from the movies. I love that. Like, I would love to see them do another attraction like this with modern movies.
See, I respectfully disagree.
And that's fine.
I love Hollywood, like Planet Hollywood, for that. Like, hey, there's movie props and stuff here. Like, I like that. But this whole thing was just so bizarre because I think that this was also the time, like, or not the time, but this attraction, what I remember of it now, and maybe it's just me looking back on it in a weird lens, is like there were 3 or 4 movie props, like relatively small things, and then you walked into, like, they were in the soundstage buildings, which I guess makes sense because, you know, that's kind of what these buildings were for. But you walked into the room on the soundstage and you were met with like the Narnia scene, and then out comes like the White Queen or whatever her name was. She talks to you for a little bit and then you leave through a door. Like, I remember that very distinctly, and that's not me looking at any pictures or anything. That's me going off of my memory, and it feels like a fever dream.
You know, this era for Hollywood studios for me also feels like them pulling away from knowing that the park was kind of, you know, it wasn't just for adults, but it was definitely the more adult centric park that had more thrill attractions, more places to drink, more stuff that was just aimed at an older audience. And this era feels like them pulling back and saying, we need to throw like more kid stuff in here too to draw them in, which I think is a part of Hollywood, the original Hollywood studio, at least, kind of losing a bit of what made it its own unique park.
Yeah. This is such a weird thing to talk about because I always feel like it's such a like elitist opinion to say that like Hollywood Studios was better when it like first couple years it opened and then slowly just went downhill. But like I think it kind of did, and I think that that's mostly because it was Eisner's park, right? Like
Yeah.
it was his park, and it was like the place that he could kind of do whatever he wanted. Um, Animal Kingdom had a very distinct vision. Hollywood Studios kind of did too, but how long could that last? And with Universal being open to doing more things and opening more attractions that weren't just like, hey, we're a movie lot, like they kind of had to react to it.
Yeah.
And I think like the original idea of Hollywood Studios has just not been in the parks at all since it opened. And I don't think that it's a bad thing. Like I don't think that it was that it was better when it opened, whatever. But I think that for me, it's funny that you can kind of tell that the park slowly just loses its vision.
Yeah.
And this is definitely a result of that.
And like you said, I don't think that's like an elitist opinion to have. I think you can objectively look at the park now and say that it's grander. There's more to do. It caters to a wider range of audience, which some people might say, oh, well, that makes it objectively better. But I think you make a good point that, like, yeah, sure, it didn't have nearly as much to do, but it had a concise theming, and it was,
Had a very distinct vision.
yes, and maybe you call it flawed, and in today's lens, it wasn't the most successful. But until they started changing it around to what it is now. But yeah, it had its own thing. I remember going when I was, an older kid, kind of, older kid, younger teenager, those couple of years, and it was like, even then, there still wasn't that much to do at Hollywood Studios, but we would ride Tower of Terror and Rock and Roller Coaster like 2 or 3 times while we were there. It felt more like going to a theme park, and I know that sounds bad, but it was like we wanted to ride the rides because they were thrilling, and that was okay. And it's like now Hollywood Studios is and maybe it's for the better, maybe it's not, but it has grown into more of like the full day park, which means that you have to have the different things to do, that you're probably only going to ride each thing once, and that you can't just have a ton of thrill rides over and over again. You have to have all kinds of different stuff, but at the same time, like you were saying, it lost some of what made it its original vision when they do that.
Yeah, and I think it's the part of it that kind of sticks out to me specifically with the whole like it lost its original vision is like I remember, I mean, this was kind of like the height of when I started going to Disney parks. Like this is when we really were like going often. And I feel like maybe that also has something to do with it. Is like I remember the most change around a lot of the like changes to Hollywood Studios, not like when it first opened, because obviously I wasn't around for that. But like when they started adding things like Lights Motor Action and stuff like that, and when they started like really moving towards a I don't want to say like a different vision, because I guess even Lights Motors Action was kind of more in tune with the idea of like a movie set. But like when they started introducing these like, oh, you step into the movie ideas, which for a while was what they were going to move towards. And I think that maybe that would have been a better next step for the parks.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but I think that that's an interesting era to look at, and it's probably is their darker ages, with Animal Kingdom being the Renaissance period.
Yes.
She also had on here, again, we had some few ideas that were unique for the time for the unique and weird incorporations era, like Lights Motors Action, Toy Story Mania, which obviously still around, and then Soarin' and Expedition Everest. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about too, if like we're marking them as like the Renaissance era is Animal Kingdom, because I would probably put it sometime from Animal Kingdom's opening till about 2006-ish. That's probably where I would say the Renaissance era ends.
Mm-hmm.
Because then she makes the point that obviously 2012 to present is the IP cash grab era, with the bringing it back to Mel's suggestion that this topic had a good concept, thinking that Frozen Ever After was the beginning of the IP era, but I think it began a few years prior with the New Fantasyland opening, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that that's when Disney kind of started to really incorporate the IPs more, and I think that that's interesting. I feel like I remember the reception to New Fantasyland being a lot better than it probably was too.
Yeah, I agree with that. Not to take anything away from it, I think as a land in and of itself, it's incredibly well done. It's very, very detailed theming, and it's just beautiful. But at the same time, like, yeah, what did we really get that much when New Fantasyland opened? I mean, we got Seven Dwarfs, but what else was really that groundbreaking at the time with New
Um,
Fantasyland?
yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. I mean, you had Be Our Guest as an immersive restaurant, which we really weren't seeing much of before that. And that's kind of paved the way for things like Space 220 and um, some of the more intricately themed restaurants, I would say. But as far as attractions, like, there's really nothing.
Yeah. But yeah, overall, I mean, yeah, I think it's very easy to see Disney shifting into this IP base for the vast majority of the attractions that they're coming out with. Which, you know, Disney's always had Disney IP in the park. That makes sense, and especially in Magic Kingdom. But this really, I feel like, is the biggest change to when we see it starting to take over existing stuff and Disney needing to make e-ticket level IP based attractions. Because when you
Yeah.
look at it, a lot of the IP based attractions in the past were not really e-ticket attractions. You know,
No.
a lot of the e-ticket attractions were original idea stuff. And there were smaller things that they would throw the IP in with, but yeah,
Nothing
now
major. Yeah.
no, now it's like if something comes out and it's okay. I understand things have changed and it's probably how it's going to be at least for a while, but it's like Disney's got to make money for the shareholders, so they know the IP will sell. They know that it will draw people into the park if they have a new e-ticket attraction. Look at Guardians of the Galaxy, like that's obviously going to bring tons of people into Epcot because it's based off a movie that almost everybody loved. It's simple economics, but at the same time, it kind of disheartening to see this shift, and we always want new original IP attractions to come out.
Yeah, I agree. And it's weird because, like, I think the IP era is probably the best way to define this, because I want to break it out a little more and say, like, you know, that era where they were doing things like introducing New Fantasyland, Frozen comes along and stuff like that. Like, yeah, it's so easy to say that that's the start of the end. And then, like, I also want to bring up the fact that, you know, Galaxy's Edge and Pandora were probably hallmarks of the IP era, but don't feel like they belong in the same era. Like, they definitely follow that same philosophy where it's like, this is based off of a movie and it's going to draw people in because people love the movie. But I also think that they're kind of like the next wave of how things are going to go. Like, maybe that is the start of the Renaissance with Galaxy. Well, probably even not even Renaissance, but I guess second Renaissance if there is one. Um, of like Pandora, and I think that that kind of is, even though that's based off of an IP, it's so widely praised as like a hallmark of good theme park design. Like, I think it's kind of hard to ignore that and lump it in with just other IP attractions.
No, and I definitely agree with that. Just saying that, oh, Disney's using existing IP isn't always necessarily a knock to them. Like you're saying, they've shown that doing something like that is possible and can be done to good taste. But at the same time, I think that's the difference. If Disney was saying, okay, we're going to take and make, whole areas or parks based on existing IP so that we can really dive into the theming and use that as inspiration, which I think is exactly what they did with Pandora. That's awesome. I'm all for that. I'm behind it. But it's just like, oh, when we take a movie and we, make a kind of half-developed dark ride so that we can throw it somewhere in the park so that we know that people for the next 5 years will want to go to it, and then who cares after that? We'll come out with something else. Like that's not using IP to, a good use. In my opinion.
No, I get you, and I agree with that. I think we're in such a weird period now because we still are experiencing, I guess, maybe a rebirth of Disney parks, but I don't know. I'm excited for what comes next, and I guess a lot of people are, maybe if they're bitter about it or they're jaded by it, they're still excited for the possibility of what Disney can do.
So I guess that brings up the question: what do you think is the next era that we'll see after this IP based era that we're in now?
I don't know. So I know that that's kind of like a cowardly thing to say, but I think it goes two ways, right? Like we could have a fantastic like rebirthal era of Disney where things just come back to full circle of innovation and design, and Disney's still kind of proving that they are, some of the best at doing what they do, even if people get mad at them on the internet for a misplaced support structure on a spaceship. Like the theming is pretty bar none for a lot of the things they've come out with, and Galaxy's Edge is still relatively new. I mean, even look at Galactic Star Cruiser, right? Like we just talked about that. A lot of the theming elements, while we haven't seen the finished product, they seem pretty much on track for what we expect from Disney. Like we expect immersion, we expect top-notch stuff, we expect to be wrapped up in that story. And I think that that's kind of a sign that Disney's still fighting for that spot, even if people are counting them out. Which maybe sounds like I'm kind of like sucking up here a little bit, but I think that that's what I think is like we have that option, or it could go the complete opposite way where like all of that stuff from 2017 that was announced never comes to fruition, or it comes in a half-assed way and we get like super budgeted versions. Like Galactic Star Cruiser opens and like you can see outside and the windows aren't tinted to the Star Wars screens like we expect them to be, or maybe we actually are just transported in the back of a box truck with no theming like we were complaining about weeks ago. Like that stuff could happen, and it's very possible. But I think that we're at such a point now where like it either goes to the extremes of the spectrum, like either end of the extreme spectrum. I don't think that there's a middle ground.
Yeah. I think that we're going to see this IP era pretty much written out. And this is just my opinion, but I think until we see a fifth gate open, I think that Disney has been so profitable over the last few years with them leaning so heavily into this IP based, as Beth calls it, the cash grabbing era. I think it's very accurate, but I don't think until Disney gets a chance to sit down and have a massive project with, I mean, obviously Pandora was a huge project, Galaxy's Edge was a huge project, but there's still only sections of the park. Until Disney has a chance to say, hey, we have to come up with something new that can't just be IP based, that has to have this cohesive theming. And I don't think that's really going to happen until a fifth gate opens. I think that's going to be the next chance for Disney to break away from this IP based.
So I guess that also brings up a question too. How far off do you think we are from that? I know we always talk about like the possibility of a fifth gate, and it always seems like it's years and years off. But honestly, I don't know. If we're in that spectrum, like you said, where we're riding this IP wave for years and years, I think there's only so much of the park that we can renovate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we hit a point where you can't touch a lot of Magic Kingdom. And I mean, I guess you could, but like a lot of that still draws in a crowd. So yeah, Tomorrowland, we can level that, right? Like we can go in there and do something in Tomorrowland. Tomorrowland still got room to grow. Epcot's mostly got room to grow still because they announced most of what they're planning to do to that. I don't know that they can do much more to Animal Kingdom besides Dino Land. And then Hollywood Studios is always, I mean, there's half a park there, right? So another 10 years, maybe 10, 20.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the timeline of things because this is by far the longest period of time that Disney has gone, since opening Disney World, that they've opened a new park there. I mean, over twice as long as any of the other periods of time between parks. So, on the one hand, it feels like it should be soon, but I don't think it is. I think, uh, I
I
think
don't think it's as far as we expect it to be, but I also don't think it's right around the corner.
no. I mean, I think it would be silly to think that Disney isn't thinking about this, but at the same time, I don't think Disney needs to.
Yeah.
As a fan, of course, I want a fifth gate. Like, make my AP worth more again. I want it. I'd love to see what they could come up with, but at the same time, looking at it from a financial perspective, why would they?
Yeah. No,
Bank on what they're doing now. They're revitalizing older areas of the parks, and they don't necessarily need to, but I'd love to see it.
yeah, I think that's kind of like where I end up landing with it right now is like, I think 10 years from now, maybe we'll get the announcement about it, but the actual fifth gate isn't for another maybe 20 years at a minimum.
Yeah.
I'm very surprised that we didn't get a new water park. that's the part that I'm more surprised about.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see how much Disney loved to try to undercut Universal Studios when they opened Hollywood Studios, and with Volcano Bay coming out and seeming to be such a huge success that I'm surprised that Disney hasn't done that. I'm curious to see the numbers of how much the water parks make them though, because I feel like there's gotta be diminishing returns, right? Between like opening your first water park, obviously that's going to draw in a huge number of crowds. Opening two, okay, now there's something else to do. We can choose between the two water parks, but by the time you open the third water park, how many more guests is that really drawing in? So I wonder if it would make financial sense for Disney to open a third one.
Yeah, or here's another thought. They don't open a third one. Instead, they revitalize the two and just combine them somehow while keeping the two open, and then shut down the two.
Honestly, yeah. Well, I guess at one point, if you want to consider River Country, they did have 3 water parks. So I think River Country is more of its own thing, though, personally. But yeah, I don't know, man. I were just saying, I don't see Disney opening an actual like fifth gate. I would like to see them. I don't know. Maybe this seems dumb to some people, but I think it would be kind of cool for them to open some kind of like, I don't know what you want to call it, like a small adventure park where it has like something like go-karts and more like just like putt-putt based, or even like we talked before, like if they started doing escape rooms and stuff on property, like stuff like that. I feel like Disney could section off a small area of the property and do something like that to kind of give guests a different experience.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that would set a new park up for a lot more success than hey, here's another amusement park with more attractions. Like,
Yeah.
I definitely think that would be a unique enough concept to float on its own.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's all I've got in terms of park eras, unless you have something else you want to contribute.
No, that's pretty much it for me. I think it's very interesting to go back and look at how much stuff has changed, and some stuff does seem to fall very neatly into these defined categories. But like we talked about with a lot of the stuff that came out in what we would call that dark age in the like 2000s. Like, yeah, that seemed like a dark time, but there's stuff in there that, like you were saying, like Soarin' and Expedition Everest that came out, that it's like those were incredible.
Yeah, and
And
I think even if you look at the eras of movies, you kind of find that too. Like, there's definitely movies that came out in those periods where Disney was just not on their A game, but still are. Some of them are my favorite movies.
yeah, that's a good point, and I think that just speaks to really the Disney Corporation as a whole. They'll have ups and downs, go through different leaders, but eventually they kind of right the wrongs and get things back on track. So I'm hoping that that's what we're about to see, with kind of moving on from this IP based into more original ideas. I think eventually Disney's going to start getting it right again.
Here's hoping.
Here's hoping.
Please stand clear of the doors. Por favor, manténganse alejado de las puertas.